Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched Hunters. Let's talk about it. So Hunters is an Amazon Prime series that explores the very interesting question of what the hell happened to the Nazis after World War II. Yes, this series that is loosely based on real events aims to answer that question. And here the answer seems to be that some of the high-ranking Nazis who had very specialized knowledge in their fields were scooped up after the war by the US government and by US spy agencies in order to utilize that knowledge for various means, as well as preventing the USSR from getting them as well. And by the way, the show doesn't really explore the role of the USSR in huge depth, but I have no doubt in my mind that if the US managed to get their grubby little hands on some of these Nazis, then I'm sure the USSR did as well. I really enjoyed, or was rather very intrigued by the way that this show depicted how these Nazis incepted their way into American society and became a part of the DNA of America during this time so seamlessly. And that, of course, was by design by the US government and these spy agencies. But as a result of that, it became entirely unfathomable. People couldn't even imagine the idea of Nazis living amongst them. And through this show demonstrates the cracks in the facade, the cracks within the American dream, America where anyone can make it, including Nazis who managed to escape their fate after committing horrid crimes against humanity. And the show depicts these cracks in the facade by displaying these really kind of quirky and irreverent segments within it. And these serve to really juxtapose against the very serious and dour tone of the show overall. And some people might say that's a bit messy in terms of the tonal shift. And I would say that sometimes it doesn't quite click, but I think in those moments the show is really trying to demonstrate just how these jigsaw pieces just don't fit together, and how it's crazy that these Nazis have been able to exist and live their lives and thrive even beneath the surface. This show also does a pretty good job of giving us some variety in terms of its depiction of the Nazis as well as the hunters themselves. Not everyone is on the same page when it comes to either side of the ideological spectrum. Some of the Nazis that have integrated themselves into the US do have an agenda. They do want to bring forth a Fourth Reich and take over the US and ultimately the world, and have this very devious plan to do so. But then there are others who just want to move on from the horrors of the past, and they try to escape that reality and just live out their American dream in the land of the free. But what this show reiterates and constantly reminds us over and over is that regardless of what the ultimate fates are of these Nazis and their side in the ideological spectrum, they owe a debt to over 10 million people whose lives were destroyed, whose lives ended, whose lives were impacted in such horrific ways because of the impact of their actions, that they need to most definitely pay for the crimes against humanity that they committed. But then, of course, the big question becomes whether the hunters have the right, whether they have the moral ground to actually be the judge, jury, and executioners. And these really deep philosophical questions and themes are what really make this series shine at its brightest. In terms of the characters, we're going to be going through a couple of them in this section, and then perhaps diving into some of the ones that I wasn't quite a huge fan of. First things first, you have Logan Lerman portraying Jonah, who's the main protagonist in this story. And in this story, his grandmother dies. She's killed by, later on it's revealed, a Nazi, one of the Nazis in hiding, and he has this huge weight on his shoulder as a result of it. He is in mourning throughout the entire series, and it leads him to do some things that he perhaps at the beginning would never have done. And it definitely leads to a dramatic character shift, which is very interesting to observe. And I think Logan Lerman does a good job of portraying the character who's in mourning, but he's also so angry and has so much resentment. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that he's the most charismatic or interesting protagonist out there. Much like the boys, I think the world around him is much more interesting than him himself. This series also highly emphasized the fact that Al Pacino is also in it, and I initially thought, pretty much like everyone else, that he would just kind of be this kind of cameo character that kind of popped up here and there, perhaps like a Nick Fury in the Avengers type situation. But actually, he is a very important part of this series. He plays the role of of Maya, who becomes a sort of surrogate kind of grandfather figure, although is he a surrogate grandfather figure to Jonah, and he kind of leads him on the path with the whole hunter crew, you know, coming together and fighting this evil lurking beneath the surface of American society. I think Al Pacino is pretty good here, although I'm no one to comment on his performance, but I definitely think that he sells the role, in particular considering the actual impact of the huge plot twist of the story, which is of course that he ends up being the wolf. That very much hinges on his performance throughout the series, so he's able to give a very kind of paternalistic performance towards Jonah's character and really give him this kind of sense of safety and security at a time when he's most vulnerable. But at the same time, there's always that feeling that just beneath the surface, kind of like the Nazis that exist in the US in general, just beneath the surface there's some kind of evil there, there's something that's not quite right. So that when the twist is revealed, it feels like whilst it's kind of shocking, it doesn't really come out of nowhere. It makes sense. Although I will say that the scene in which the twist is revealed isn't the best. It's very expositional. They're very much kind of standing around and explaining the whole thing. I think the show could have done a better job at dropping in a few hints here and there so that it didn't feel like such an expositional dump. Next up, you have Jerrica Hinton as Millie, and I very much enjoyed this character, especially because they didn't make her this really annoying cop or detective character who's working against the protagonist the entire time and butting heads with the people that we're supposed to be rooting for. That's always very frustrating. I'm thinking of, you know, Luke Cage and Misty in that series, where sometimes it can get a bit annoying when she's kind of working against the good guys. In this case, she does kind of open up to a bit more compromise for the greater good as she realizes what the greater good actually is, and she starts to question whether or not she was on the right side all along. I also appreciated the fact that she is an LGBTQ character in the series, and it's not something that they kind of make a huge deal out of, but it's definitely something that is very impactful when it comes to her character and the experience that she has in the show and in their world. And again, I often talk about how I'm really optimistic about the variety in the depiction of Black characters and Black female characters in media, and this is just another example of that. As for Sister Harriet, I'm very interested to see where the hell that character is gonna go, because I have no idea, and I'm glad that the first season didn't reveal everything on that front, because she is such a confusing character. Her motivations, her past, her everything is just so opaque that I'm looking forward to seeing them unravel the story behind this character. And finally, as a positive, I will say that I very much enjoy the style of this show, and I like how it embraces the kind of 70s culture in its costuming and its set designs and everything, as well as giving us a really cool soundtrack to kind of jive to. Now let's get into some of the things that I wasn't such a huge fan of when it came to Hunters. First things first, I will say that the glaring issue that this show has is definitely with its tonal inconsistencies. Now, as I mentioned before, there are these kind of segments that are a bit more irreverent and jokey, but at the same time have a very real message underlining them. And these segments, I think, work in one aspect in order to kind of provide this juxtaposition between, again, a very serious subject matter with some like lightheartedness that's very reminiscent of 70s TV shows. So I get what they're trying to do in using this kind of dark humor and sarcasm to convey these really serious and disturbing messages. But at the same time, I do think it kind of suffers from a tonal problem when it comes to the whole picture, when it comes to the whole show. And I would actually compare this to Jojo Rabbit, which also uses dark humor that is very Taika Waititi and blends it into the kind of backdrop of Nazi Germany. And in that case, I very much felt like the humor and the kind of lightheartedness, or the faux lightheartedness of that film, kind of overtook the seriousness of the whole situation just by a little bit. I don't think it was too jokey. There were definitely moments of darkness there. But in the case of Hunters, it's the complete opposite, where the majority of the show feels so heavy and it's so serious, and we get these sequences in the concentration camps and in the work camps and these horrible conditions that people had to live in, to kind of juxtapose that with these kind of funny, quirky 70s show tribute segments just doesn't quite fit for a lot of the time. And the characters are also symptomatic of the tonal disjointedness. For example, you have the characters of Murray and Mindy, who are survivors. They are Holocaust survivors who endured utmost suffering and just so many horrible things, and they're brought into this team, and they bring their own skill set into the team, but I don't think that they quite fit as part of this badass 70s type team that is, you know, living their ordinary lives by day and taking down Nazis by night. Like, I don't think that they really have a role in that side of the show. I think they very much have a role in the storytelling and the serious aspect of the effects of the Holocaust. The character of Roxy is also on the team, and she very much plays an archetypical 70s type black female badass who's also a Black Panther. And the big point of contention when it comes to her character is that instead of supporting her own cause, she's kind of on the hunters and fighting for their cause and fighting against Nazis. But I think the show doesn't really do a good enough job of highlighting the fact that, one, this is a very human issue. It's not just a Jewish issue. Nazis existing in the US is very much an alarm for most people in that country. So I definitely think the show could have very much emphasized that a bit more, and we'll talk about that later on in another point. But secondly, I will say that she didn't really have much of a personality to her. Her character was very two-dimensional and very archetypical, unlike the character of Millie. So I don't think that she felt necessary. She never really felt necessary when it came to her position in the team. Speaking of being entirely unnecessary, the character of Lonnie, he doesn't need to be there. I don't know why he is there. He's so useless. Like, what is his skill? That he's an actor? That he's talkative? That he... I don't know. I don't know why he's there. I thought he was largely irrelevant. I think it's nice that he kind of bonded with Jonah, was looking out for him throughout the show, but I don't think he was necessary whatsoever. And then you have the character of Joe, who has this really emotional, really interesting backstory that the show never really gives enough time to explore. It doesn't really explore in the depth that it... Honestly, he could have his own show. Just going off of his backstory and going off of his journey, he could have his own show, his own Daredevil type show, because it's honestly such a fascinating story with him, and it's a shame that the show kind of disregards it and uses him as pretty much a token character where he could really shine on his own. And speaking of tokenism, listen, I wouldn't say that this show uses tokenism. I wouldn't say that whatsoever, because the diversity of the show, the racial diversity of the show, is very much integral to it. They very much made an effort to have racial diversity on the team and in the world at large when it comes to this show, and I very much appreciated that. And I think for the most part it works brilliantly. However, I think they missed the opportunity to take into account the racial diversity of the team and of the cast in general, and have that be a reflection of the impact of Nazism, the impact of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany and beyond throughout World War II on many different racial groups and many different groups of peoples at that time. I thought that this show would do something that nothing else really has, and explore the impact of the Nazi regime on not just the Jewish peoples, although of course they were the biggest victims of this horrific regime, but also on Black people, also on different religions like Catholics and travelers, you know, gypsy travelers, and, you know, homosexual people and people with disabilities. And they do touch on slightly people with disabilities and how they would have been impacted in Joe's storyline as he goes to visit that guy that used to fight with him in Vietnam. But that's definitely something that they could have explored even deeper in that very episode, and explore how they're fighting against something as well. They're fighting against persecution for their own kind, as well as for the Jewish population that was decimated in Nazi Germany. My final criticism of this show would definitely be its length. It does not need to be 10 episodes long. There is so much filler here. It definitely feels like some parts are just moving so slowly, and I think it would have been so much better if it was a cool 8 episodes, just perfect. We're filling it in to the brim with action, with stuff happening, and everything feels relevant and everything feels impactful and perfect. Just 8 episodes would have been fine. But instead we have 10 episodes, and as a result we have about 2 episodes worth of filler that kind of dilutes the strength of the show as a whole. So considering everything that I just said, I'm going to be giving Hunters a 7 out of 10. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys what my thoughts were on Hunters, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of the show down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!